discussing Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. It's a novel written around the 1950s about the turmoil of Russia, pre-revolution, civil war, and then a little bit after the revolution. The book ends with a bunch of poems. It's a very, very, very good book. That's has to be said. It's written in a style that is sometimes a bit demanding for readers. It doesn't have a modern, catchy, twisty, sexy kind of plot, but you gotta have to abstract from that and just take the importance of the book, which is a very subtle, a beautiful description of a time when people are disoriented, of a time when the state collapses, the leviathan gets taken over by its people, and a new leviathan is in the making. This is what happened to Russia. Like one of the quotes of the book, which is, it all starts with lofty ideologies and good ideas, and then it turns material and coarse. We're all children, but we're actually sons. We're sons of people, and now we're children. We are not sons anymore, which is a beautiful metaphor of what happened in the revolution when history was rewritten. You're not the son anymore of your father. You're not a sequence of historical event. You broke with your past. You broke with your legacy. You disrupted the ancien regime, and you brought something new to bear. Now, in the case of Russia, that something new was terrible. And I think the biggest question that I have is, why didn't it work in Russia? Why didn't it work in France? Why did it work in the United States? This is one of the fundamental questions that I think one has to ask oneself. And in Dr. Zhivago, this question is not discussed too much. Again, like lofty ideals turn into coarse materialism. The Russian Enlightenment turned into the Russian Revolution, into Stalin. Terror, horrible things happen in the name of some imaginary revolution. I think Pasternak really shows beautifully how people change, how there are people that at the beginning maybe are not so sure what's going on, and then very quickly turn into party echo chambers. Now, the main character, Dr. Zhivago, Yuri Andreevich, he is stoic. He sticks with his guns. It's not clear what he stands for. In the poems at the end of the book, there's some, he alludes towards God and Christianity and spirituality, and I think this reminds me a little bit of Nietzsche. God is dead. There's a poem where they bury God, and then what comes after that is a fig tree without fruits. So the spring, the new life that follows the death and the destruction, bears new trees, but they don't have fruit. There's no food. There's no intellectual food. There's no material food. Destruction. And again, we are not children. Excuse me, we are not sons anymore. We're children. Now this definitely reminds one of today's time, woke revolution in the United States. In my opinion, it happened after a coup d'etat, which happened through COVID. So we had a revolution here, and we're living through it, and we're fighting against it, and it's very important that we fight against it. And I think Zhivago is a stern reminder of what happens when we don't fight against these new fruitless trees that come out of nowhere, that tell us that we're not sons anymore. By the way, sons, daughters, it's not about identity. It's just the meaning is, we are not descendants of somebody. We're somehow something new. We're somehow detached from our past, and we rewrite the past. And if we rewrite the past, we basically have the right to do anything we want, and terror spreads through the land. This is the message, and the message is, Pasternak is not making this up, right? He has ample evidence of what actually happened. So the novel is a beautiful depiction of a turmoil time when there's no compass and when people take it into their own hands to decide what is and what isn't. And it's not even clear who it is. It's like, there's another beautiful quote. It's like watching the grass grow. You can't tell it was this guy. It was Lenin or Stalin or Marx or Trotsky or whoever. You can't tell. It's like watching the grass grow. It just happens. And next thing you know, the grass has outgrown everything, and you have these trees without fruits, sucking all the energy out of the system, destroying the land, and really making life miserable for everybody. I mean, this is what happened in Russia. It's still happening in Russia. This is not even a podcast. It's October 21st, 2024. This is Krindelko. For the day, the fund is up 95 basis points. The market is up 30 basis points. For the year, we are up 15.6%. The market is up 22.7%. We're underperforming by 7.1%. Dr. Zhivago, it's a novel written by Boris Pasternak about the turmoil of Russia, the change between the pre-revolution time, the civil war between the whites and the reds, and then post-revolution, and then all the way towards World War II. So it's a time in Russia when everything changes. I've discussed the Lenin biography, which covers all the events prior to the revolution and then the revolution itself. This is a different view of things. In other words, this is not a chronological description of events. This is a personal, subtle, emotional, human view of these events. And I think fundamentally what Pasternak is bringing across is this feeling of being in a vacuum, feeling of being in a directionless plethora of possibilities, of hope even. There's hope. There is something akin to a new beginning. These things do exist. Like I said in the prelude, it starts with lofty ideals. There is a problem in Russia. Pre-revolution, people are being enslaved. There is an aristocracy that is oblivious of what the people care, want, and don't like about the situation in Russia. The problem with the war and the civil war, though, is that it turns into a fight between people who don't exactly stand for anything in particular other than their material well-being. And I think that's one of the main problems of the Russian Revolution, is that the ideology wasn't clear enough. Like, you can fight for an ideology, whether it's a good one or a bad one, that is, up for debate. For example, when the Christians fought the Vikings in the north, they did fight for an ideology that actually prevailed. When the Americans fought for the revolution, they fought for the Constitution of the United States. To paraphrase Vivek Ramaswamy, the biggest, best, or the most effective mission statement ever written in at least in a social context. But anyway, it doesn't matter whether it's for a company or for a country. So when you have something strong to bind you, when you fight for the same, let me paraphrase David Deutsch. Says, look, wokeism is not so bad because the people who stand for it, they change their mind all the time. It's not a strong ideology. It is anti-liberty. It is undermining our freedoms. It is causing things like censorship and sometimes even more. But it's not a strong ideology. Even Marxism was stronger. Now, of course, you can ask the question, well, wasn't the Russian Revolution a Marxist revolution? No, it wasn't. Lenin tweaked the necessities of the times, Lenin tweaked the ideology of his revolution towards the necessities of his time. And that was his original sin. That's why this turned into such a nightmare. Had he stuck with orthodox Marxism, for example, had he stuck with that, I believe the revolution would have been different, and most likely Lenin would have lost. He wouldn't even have been at the helm, and things would have changed differently. Because if you had this fundamental orthodox view of what Marxism should be, which is, let's say, the classes, they take over, and communism is a sort of shared property type place or something along those lines. But he couldn't, of course, because the necessities of the time required a strong army. It required some sort of monetary extraction because he wanted to bring the revolution globally. So he turned into something that most tyrants in the 19th and 20th century had to deal with, which is they had to become bigger and bigger and move to keep their power, namely Napoleon and Hitler, and then later on Stalin. So Hitler was in the same trap. So if you kept, what I'm saying here is, if you kept the revolution more orthodox, stick with a few concise values that people can abide to, I think you would have had a much bigger success. Take, for example, cults that work today. The cult around Elon Musk is driven by engineering, technology, science, optimism. Those are things that we all share. We, meaning people that stand for either as investors for Tesla or as believers in the message of what Elon Musk and his companies are proclaiming. You can't argue with that. Even somebody who hates Musk politically or because he's a bigot or whatever, you can't argue against optimism. You can't argue against progress. That's very difficult to undermine, even if people try, like people like Mark Cuban are trying all the time, but of course it's futile. You can't fight that. So what I'm saying here is that one of the big lessons of Dr. Zhivago is that what went wrong in the Russian Revolution, if you look at it through the lens of Yuri Andreevich and his family and the people around this story, you can see that there was a lack of coherence, there was a lack of orthodoxy, and therefore the revolution became of a matter-of-fact revolution. It became of more of a like, oh, okay, we need this type of content to justify X, and we need this type of content to justify Y, and that's why it turned into what it became, which is a horrible, horrible human tragedy, which is what the Russian Revolution and the subsequent events in Russia, all the way till today. You can even throw in today and the war in the Ukraine. It's the same. It's the same trajectory. There is a lack of coherence. There's a lack of orthodoxy. There is some sort of gibberish of, maybe today it's some sort of, reinvigorating the Russian Empire with some sort of orthodox religious underpinning. But that's not what people believe in either. So it's really one of the biggest, it's the original sin of Lenin, it's the original sin of every tyrant, which is adjust your ideology to the daily needs, versus I think the right way to start a revolution, if you really want to start one, or the right way to try to change people's minds and win people's hearts, is to stick with the message, to have an idea, have an orthodoxy, and then sell it to the people. And if they don't like it, then you know what, that's it, you can't win. But to adjust and forcefully stuff it down the throats of people, that is not a good idea, and it ends up in this calamity, again, that we call Russian Revolution. I want to say a few more things about this book, about the technique. I think it's beautifully done. I recently attended a seminar about life writing, which is sort of this 19th century invention, if you will. Actually, it started even earlier in England with the invention of the novel, and the novel being sort of a depiction of detailed life, of circumstances of people, and embed that in a broader context and tell a story. And I think that this is really what this story is about. There is no particular description or allusion towards some sort of moralizing about the revolution. There are people, they have stances, particularly Dr. Zhivago, the main character. He's a stoic figure. There are other people that are a little bit more bendable, but let's stick with Dr. Zhivago. I think, let me just say this. The characters speak for themselves. Very strong character buildup, which is, of course, in the tradition of the Russian novelist culture, in the Russian novelist tradition. This is very Tolstoyesque or Dostoevsky-esque. I don't think that's a word. But my point is, like, you build very strong characters through life writing. So you describe their lives, their thoughts, their emotions, their feelings, and you don't philosophize more than that. You don't go beyond that. Now, in the novel, there are these strong characters, and then sometimes there are these comments or almost philosophical treatises, short ones, and then of course there's the long end of the tail end of the book, which is really poems, and that's a very strong philosophical, poetic, I would say, landing of the book, and gives you really all the juice you need to understand, okay, what the hell just happened here? I think that's what Boris, in my opinion, was trying to do with the poems at the end. Okay, here's what happened. You know, they put God to bed, they buried God, they resurrected something new, and that something new took its own path, and it couldn't bear any fruits. It was not impregnated in the right way, and therefore it became a calamity. Something along those lines. There's a beautiful line in the book, which is the calamity of bad art is much worse than the calamity of tastelessness. And I've used this for other areas, and particularly you could say the calamity of bad revolutions is much, much worse than the calamity of inaction. So you wanna, like, when you do something, I guess this is the way I understand this quote, when you do something, whether it's art, revolution, business, do it well. Do it the best you can. Don't do it halfway. Mediocrity is the disaster that comes with a disastrous revolution. And this is also a critique that Boris has, Pasternak, through his book, through the characters, that what followed in the Russian Revolution, the art and the philosophy and the science, which was evolved in Russia and even till today, is all full of mediocrity, except, of course, the really hard sciences like math and physics, where for some reason they let people go. They gave people enough liberty to develop good science, particularly in math and physics. And obviously that was necessary because they needed that for the army and the nuclear weapons race and all that. But everything else, I mean, who has heard anything about Russian art recently? I mean, it stopped with Tchaikovsky and then Rachmaninoff, but he came to the United States, right? And ever since, we don't talk about Russian art, we don't talk about Russian literature, because it's non-existent. And it's not just because it's censored, it's because also there is a sort of a class system in a situation like that in a country like Russia, where mediocrity gets promoted. And I think I want to finish this conversation with some comments about today, because it's tempting and important to draw parallels to today. Let me set the stage here. First and foremost, I believe we had a coup d'etat with COVID. This wasn't just some sort of pandemic. It was a takeover of power. Whether it was intentional or not, that's not even the point, but it happened. And people like Anthony Fauci and the Democratic Party under him, with him, around him, took power. They won the election. And they, ever since, really changed or attempt to change the culture of this country into a coercive, into a coercive society with coercion and a culture that is antagonistic towards the U.S. Constitution. And I mean, here's just one example how mediocrity proliferates in a system like that. So I was at a robotics seminar last week, and the person that was presenting, I thought, was not really up to the level of what Stanford usually brings. And then, lo and behold, at the end, he starts talking about some woke BS, DEI, I don't know, discriminates against people in robotics and wants some other type of race should be more presented, and just horrible stuff, horrible, totally out of control, totally out of context. And I guess my point here is, like, you have this mediocrity in the science, and then it's not a coincidence that somebody like that breaks the, I would say, unwritten rules of Stanford, which is we don't talk about these things, particularly not in engineering practices. If you have a problem with race, if you think that certain races should be somehow discriminated against in favor of other races because I don't know what your problem is, then do it somewhere else. There are forums for that, but not in a robotics seminar about engineering, about how robots should work, how we can make robots better and easier to maneuver and things like that. So again, this is just as a side note. Back to today and back to the relationship between Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago and today, I think fundamentally, again, I guess the main message is, look, a revolution, a change in culture can happen, should happen. Like everything, we're very Popperian about this. We can always replace existing structures and ideas with better ones. But what we cannot do is impose new ideas, or like there's another beautiful quote in the book, which is that the revolution, the Russian Revolution, just removed the old limitations and replaced them with new limitations. And then those limitations, the people bowed to those new limitations. That's not okay. That's not the real revolution, like the US revolution when they fought the Brits, was that we remove the limitations and we actually remove limitations and put ourselves in the context of a constitution, which is just a replacement of the Bible, or if you will, some spiritual underpinning of the society. That's what the US Constitution was, a spiritual underpinning of the society that everybody could stand to, even today. Even today, if there's one thing that puts us all together as Americans, and I'm not even a passport holder, but I feel very American because I swear allegiance to the US Constitution, not to the flag, not to the race, not to any of that stuff, but to the US Constitution. This is the most successful mission statement ever in the history of human mankind, and I am willing to fight for to keep that alive. And that's what Elon Musk is doing. That's what hopefully will happen if Trump wins, at least to some extent. I don't think Trump himself has a strong opinion about these things, but the people around him, the people who are anti-woke, who are anti the big state, deep state, democratic, one-party driven shenanigans that have been going on ever since COVID. All these people, I think a lot of them at least, are in the business now of trying to restore the values of the US Constitution, and then we can go back. We can go back and have elections and presidents, and we can have all kinds of things. But we need to have the values of the US Constitution reestablished. And one of the most important things about that, and this is of course my baby, and I always come back to that, so I'm going to mention it here too, it is of course the Fed and the money. Because if we keep printing money and monetizing US national debt, then we can't fix this country. We have to stop. We have to put a constraint on the policymakers. We have to put a constraint on the executive branch as much as on the legislative, on all the branches of the US government. And we have to reduce the deep state because it's out of control. Even academia. Why? There's a recent tweet about how most academic institutions are democratic. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but you could argue the following way. This has nothing to do with people's conviction or anything like that. It is that the deep state is financed by the Fed, by money printing, and a lot of institutions, a lot of academic institutions, they get money, grants from the government. And they tend to be democratic, not in sort of an ideological way, but it is usually the democratic side of the aisle, which is pro spending more money for quote unquote studies and things like that. So that's what the academic institutions really want, and that's why they're democratic, not because they want to do whatever else. There are ideological lofty goals that Democrats have. More equality, more opportunity for people, and things like that, which is great. We all stand for that, but we can't have the communications department of Brown University basically censoring everybody because they're getting paid by a democratically led agency somewhere in Washington, D.C. that wants that to be legitimized. So things along those lines. Or even worse, we have studies about medicine and drugs and things like that, which are financed by democratically dominated agencies and really financed by the pharma industry. So we can't have that. We need to break that. We need to have more checks and balances. We need to have a more competition for a say and money, and we need to have a constraint. Money has to be constrained. So sorry for this digression. This is a discussion of Dr. Zhivago, the book. But I just wanted to say a few things about today and how this book reminds me of some developments of today and how it's high time that we need to avoid what happened in Russia. We need to avoid any kind of similarity with this fig tree that grows without fruits, with this limitation, or getting rid of limitation and just replacing them with new limitations. We need to fight that. We have all the ingredients. We're the wealthiest nation in the world. We have the best technologies in the world. We have some beautiful technologies on the horizon, which will open up horizons and opportunities for this new generation. It is our job. It is our job as adults to have our sons and daughters, to give them a better future, because they're our sons and daughters. And this is, I think, the strongest quote in Dr. Zhivago, which is, they used to be sons and daughters, and now they're just children, meaning they got detached from their legacy, and that cannot happen. Because when that happens, without the underpinning of a spiritual idea that people can abide to, then things go wrong. And that's what happened in Russia under Lenin and Stalin. And that's what's going to happen here if we don't stop this. So again, to summarize, Dr. Zhivago, it's a beautiful book about the situation between sort of the beginning of the Russian Civil War, the Russian Revolution, and then the post-revolution all the way to World War II. And it depicts in a very subtle, very human way how people actually felt, how people actually navigated these times. It shows some of the really bad things that happened, even some of the good things. For example, the replacement of old structures and the replacement of maybe hierarchies that weren't exactly fair, but then, of course, they got replaced with even worse hierarchies and worse limitations. And again, the main quote in the book, or one of the main quotes, is that this revolution replaced old limitations with new limitations, when what really should be happening is that we should solve old problems with newer, better ideas and create newer and better problems. Thank you.